Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. We're going to be speaking about rep ranges. By the end of the video, you're going to have a pretty solid understanding about how to select rep ranges for your exercises and how to design your workouts better. So we're going to be speaking about what exactly a rep range signifies, what do sets signify, and what exactly goes on when we perform exercise, because it's important to understand that before we start speaking about rep ranges and sets. And we're also going to be speaking about some criteria that you need to keep in mind while selecting rep ranges, right? So without further ado, let us begin. Now, before we start speaking about how to select the ideal rep range or what is an ideal rep range, let's first understand what exactly a rep range or a set signifies in the context of an exercise, right? So, what exactly happens when we are performing an exercise? Well, there is a certain external force that is acting on the body, and in response to that force, which is a stimulus, our muscles produce a force of their own, which is called mechanical tension. And that mechanical tension can be of a large magnitude or a small magnitude, depending upon the challenge that the external force is providing us. And that magnitude of tension that our muscles produce can be produced for a short duration of time or a longer duration of time. But it is produced for a certain duration of time, and that duration of time for which our muscles produce tension is what we call a set in an exercise. And that is also what a rep range signifies. So, a lower rep range signifies a shorter duration of tension production, and a higher rep range signifies a longer duration of tension production. So, now that you have this perspective about sets and repetitions and rep ranges, you can take this understanding and apply it to static exercises as well, and it becomes more intuitive. Because when we speak about repetitions, we often assume that it only applies to dynamic exercises where the joints are moving, right? Where there's a concentric and an eccentric portion, uh, and those two combined form a repetition for the lack of better definition. But when you take this understanding of force and a certain duration of tension production, you can apply this to static or isoangular exercises as well, right? So our muscles do produce tension when we do static isoangular exercises, and they produce that tension for a certain duration of time. So instead of thinking about, oh, what is the rep range, we simply say these many seconds, right? So I hope that made the concept a little more intuitive and you understand better now. Okay. So let's move on to what the ideal rep range is. Now, there's no single ideal rep range. Ideally, you have to train across multiple different rep ranges because it has been shown that anywhere between 1 to 40 repetitions work pretty much equally well to build muscle or for muscular hypertrophy, right? But we can narrow that range down depending on a few criteria and select ranges within that 1 to 40 rep range and apply that to our training so that we can optimize for muscular hypertrophy. Now, before we move forward, I would like to clear up another misconception. People often assume that there are different rep ranges for strength and hypertrophy, and that strength and hypertrophy are completely different things, which is inherently not accurate. Because strength is simply the ability of a muscle to produce tension, and a larger muscle is going to be capable of producing more tension. So, a larger muscle is going to be a stronger muscle. The confusion creeps in because people often conflate the definition, the actual definition of strength, which is the ability of a muscle to produce tension, with the layman's definition of strength, which is basically, oh, if you're able to lift a lot of weight on a certain exercise, you must be pretty strong. Now, if you're able to lift a lot of weight on a certain exercise, that doesn't necessarily mean that your muscles are capable of producing a lot of tension. They could be, but it also involves a skill aspect, right? There is a certain skill and technique involved in performing a certain movement, and with practice, you can get better at performing a certain movement and become efficient at it, such that you won't have to produce, or rather, your muscles won't have to produce as much tension, and you can get away with producing smaller amounts of tension because you're able to recruit all the muscles that are involved in performing that movement better and coordinate them better. But if all those muscles individually were stronger, then you would be able to lift more weight. And after a certain point, that is what you have to do. You have to increase the size of your muscles in order to become stronger. Okay, so muscular hypertrophy will make you stronger. There is no special method that only makes you stronger but does not grow your muscles, right? The two are very interconnected. Now that we have cleared up that misconception, we can move on to discussing some criteria that need to be considered while selecting rep ranges. And the first criterion is muscle fiber type, or rather, the distribution of muscle fibers. So, in the human body, we have, when it comes to skeletal muscle, we have two types of muscle fibers: type 1 muscle fibers and type 2 muscle fibers. So, our type 1, they're also called slow twitch muscle fibers. They're very good at producing small amounts of tension for long durations of time, and they are quite fatigue resistant. And in order to stimulate them well enough, we have to fatigue them. And we also have type 2 muscle fibers, which are called fast twitch muscle fibers. And these muscle fibers are capable of producing large amounts of tension, but for shorter durations of time. They are not as fatigue resistant as the type 1 muscle fibers. So they are capable of producing large amounts of tension. Now, most of our muscles are made up of about an even split of type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers. So we have a pretty significant chunk of type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers in most of our muscles. Of course, there are certain outliers like the soleus muscle, which is almost entirely made up of type 1 muscle fiber. But since most of our muscles are, or rather, they do have a pretty significant chunk of type 1 and type 2 muscle fibers, in order to maximize hypertrophy and not leave anything on the table, we have to make sure that we are stimulating our muscles comprehensively using lower rep ranges and higher rep ranges. And naturally, on lower rep ranges, we will be able to use more weight, and on higher rep ranges, we will have to use lighter loads. So that covers criterion number 1. Now, coming to the second criterion, which is the nature of the exercise. So, what do I mean by nature of the exercise? Well, there are certain exercises that require a lot of technique to execute well. They are more skill heavy. The demands for skill are greater. And you can think of exercises like the barbell back squat or the deadlift, right? And these are also exercises where a lot of different muscle groups are involved. And there is that coordination and skill component that is involved. So, for these types of exercises, performing very high repetitions is probably not a good idea because you're not going to be able to stimulate all those muscles very well, and it's going to turn into more of an endurance, a cardiovascular endurance challenge. And the risk of injury also increases because the possibility of your technique breaking down due to the fatigue, the cardiorespiratory fatigue over time as you perform more repetitions, because it's just so tiring, increases. So, performing these exercises on lower rep ranges would make a lot more sense. So, by lower rep range, I mean anywhere between 6 to 10 repetitions. That's sort of the sweet spot. Now, you can go a little lower than 6 reps as well, maybe that 3 reps, 4 reps mark. And you can go a little above the 10 reps as well. These are not rigid um, guidelines. These are more of general guidelines that you can play around with. But the idea is that 6 to 10 rep range will give you a good sweet spot such that your technique doesn't get compromised, and at the same time you're able to use a load that is stimulating enough. Now, there are other types of exercises where the opposite happens, right? They're not very skill heavy. The demands for skill aren't as high. It's pretty easy to execute from a technique standpoint. Think about machine based exercises, for example, which pretty much anyone can perform. And on these exercises, you can safely explore higher rep ranges as well. So, by higher rep ranges, I mean anywhere between that 10 to 40 rep range mark. And these can look like 10 to 15 reps, 15 to 20, 20 to 30, and 30 to 40. Now, you might be thinking, wow, that's a lot of options. How do I choose, right? Well, most of your training is probably going to be between the 6 to 20 rep range mark. But it is a good idea to include some of those higher reps as well in order to make sure that we're not leaving anything on the table, because those higher reps can also motivate metabolic stress, which we know is another mechanism, possible mechanism for muscular hypertrophy along with mechanical tension. So, just to make sure we're covering all our bases, we can include those higher rep ranges as well. And you don't need to do that as a straight set. You can also include it in the form of drop sets or rest pause sets, right? So, a drop set is where you start with a certain weight, perform a few repetitions, reduce the load by about 40 to 50%, and then continue performing a few more repetitions until you can no longer perform more repetitions with the same degree of control and technique and the same level of execution. And the rest pause set is where you take small breaks when you feel fatigued in between the set and just continue performing more and more reps until you reach the desired goal. Now, that covers the nature of the exercise. Another very important consideration is joint health. So, there are certain exercises which are inherently suited to a certain rep range. Let's take a preacher curl, for example. On a dumbbell or barbell preacher curl, the very bottom position leaves our biceps in a very vulnerable position. The elbow joint is in a very vulnerable position at that bottom position. And that is because our biceps are able to produce a lot of force, but they don't have great leverage. So the connective tissues, like the tendons, end up taking up a lot of strain and they might just snap. And I'm sure you've seen videos of that all over the internet. So it's not the best idea to use very heavy loads on that exercise. It would be a lot wiser to use a higher rep range with lighter loads for that exercise and other exercises of that nature. Another one you can think of is the lateral raise. So performing the lateral raise with very heavy loads will almost always compromise your technique, and it's not going to allow you to stimulate your deltoids very well. So sticking to a slightly higher rep range, anywhere between that 10 to 40 rep range, that would be a much better idea for that exercise. Now, that covers our joint health considerations. Now, another thing that I want to make a note on is execution. So, I've told you what rep range you need to select and what things you need to keep in mind. But how should you perform these repetitions? And how do you know when you have to stop? So, as I mentioned, you must be able to perform all your repetitions with the same degree of control, the same level of technique. And when you cannot perform the next repetition with the same level of technique without compromising your form, that is when you end your set. So, you can think of it as technical failure. Now, failure itself is very overrated uh, concept, if you were to call it that. But you can think of it as technical failure. But the technical part is very important. Now, another note that I would like to add is about progressive overload, or rather, progressive tension overload, because remember, we have to progressively increase the amount of tension that our muscles produce and not just throw on more weight while compromising our technique, right? So, progressive overload is very important if you want to keep growing muscle. You have to provide your muscles with a slightly greater challenge each time to stimulate them to grow well. Okay, so how exactly do you go about doing this? And how many sets should you perform per exercise? Well, the most efficient way to select your sets or the number of sets to perform or for your exercises, for the most part, for most exercises, you only need two good quality sets. And the first set I would recommend should be performed in a lower rep range. And the second set should be performed in a slightly higher rep range. So, this way, you'll be able to stimulate your type 2 muscle fibers and your type 1 muscle fibers quite effectively. And since you are performing your lighter set in the higher rep range after you perform your heavy set initially, due to the neural adaptations from the first set, the second set with a lighter weight is going to feel lighter than it would if you had performed it by itself as a standalone set without performing the heavy set before that. So, that is going to help you squeeze out a few more repetitions and thereby increase the duration of tension production a little for a little while longer. And that's going to help you provide your muscles with a slightly better stimulus. Now, you want to progress on, or rather, progressively overload on both of these sets. So, you want to progressively overload on your first set with in the lower rep range, and you want to progressively overload on the second set with the higher rep range as well. And by virtue of having just two sets to focus on, progressive overload also becomes very simple. Now, remember I said this applies to most exercises. And the reason why I said that is for some exercises where you are still learning the technique, so exercises that demand a little more skill, it would be wiser to perform more sets, maybe 3 or 4 or even 5 sets, but with fewer repetitions. And by fewer, I mean it can be anywhere between 2 to 8 or 2 to 6 repetitions, right? And the reason for that is so that you have an opportunity to focus on your technique. And one, you'll be able to use a load that is somewhat stimulating as well, but at the same time isn't super heavy and going to cause your technique to just break down and make you injured, right? So you can focus on really improving your technique, and once you have that down, then you can play around with slightly higher repetitions and reduce the number of sets that you are performing, because you don't need that much practice anymore. Now, that covers pretty much everything that I had to discuss with you about rep range selection. I hope this video helps you improve your training at the gym, and I hope you're able to apply these guidelines and become stronger and bigger. And if you have any questions, please drop them in the comments below. I will make sure to answer all of them for you. And I really hope this helps. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you for watching.